to begin with a quote that's pretty much anonymous, although I've seen versions of it from Christian philosophers and Buddhists and Gandhi. This is it. The thought becomes the word manifests as the deed develops into the habit hardens into character gives birth to destiny. So watch your thoughts with care, and let them spring from love, born out of respect for all beings. So this is an expression of karma, which really is saying that causes lead to effects. And we tend to keep repeating and repeating and repeating. Someone will report that, well, I've been repeating the same pattern of pushing people away or grasping on or undermining myself or whatever it is all my life, or as long as I can remember. That's a real feeling of despair, because how can I ever change? It's so deeply grooved. And I think of this as a very universal kind of theme in terms of transformation, because every one of us, if we're in any way suffering because there's some patterning that has locked in, that's rooted in fear, and that we keep playing out over and over again, and it's confining our sense of being. That's why we're suffering. Three key teachings that have really shaped my life, my spiritual life, in a very deep way, and I think of them as invitations. Each of these three teachings are ways of, in a way, freeing ourselves or waking up out of the chain reaction, okay? And the first one, please don't believe your thoughts. And the second one is, please just pause and come back into presence. And the third one is, please remember love. In some way, whatever way, but remember love. But we'll begin by taking a look at what happens in our brain when we're caught in the stimulus-reaction chain. And my favorite illustration comes from Dr. Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist. He's a friend also. And what Dan does is he says, think of the brain. He says, think of the brain like this, that your wrist leading into the palm of your hand is like a spinal cord going into the skull. So this is the brain stem, okay? And then he says, this thumb is your limbic system. And this is to do with arousal and emotions and relationships. So you've got the brain stem that's really regulating your body, and it's fight, flight, freeze, okay? And then you've got the thumb, that's emotions, it's a limbic system. And he says these four fingers, okay, see it like this, is the cortex, the frontal cortex. And this is what allows us to perceive the outside world and think and reason. And the prefrontal cortex, which is the kind of bottom part of my knuckles right down here, is really the source of mindfulness, attunement, empathy, compassion. So this is the brain. And what happens when the brain is integrated, kind of holding together, is there's a flow upward of, danger, gotta do this, gotta do that, fight, flight, flee, freeze. And then downward there's it's okay, we've been here before, we know how to deal with this. And so there's fibers, literally, that come down from the prefrontal cortex that soothe and deactivate the limbic system. So there's a kind of upward flow and then a downward feedback. But what happens when we get stressed, when there's a real shooting of fear or anxiety, or it happens very regularly, is we flip our lid, okay? And we go around a lot of times kind of like this, or half open. And what that means is at those times when we're stressed and in reactivity, we're no longer getting the benefit of that insight and that perspective and that empathy that comes from the prefrontal cortex, which is the most recently evolved parts of our brain. How do we reintegrate? And again, as I mentioned, we'll start with, please just remember, this is just a thought, don't believe it, that we spend most of our time in a virtual reality. If you pause and even just think of today, if I just glance back at the day, I realize how much of the day, the swaths of moments that I was living inside that incessant dialogue going on in my brain. When we start catching on to, don't believe your thoughts, that means there's a little space around that virtual reality and a little more capacity to choose, well, are these thoughts serving healing and serving connecting with others and freedom, or are they serving that sense of a separate self, a deficient self, and a beleaguered self? We start getting some choice because there's a little more space. So if we look at thoughts a little more closely, we start getting that they are images in our mind and sound bites. Okay? They're representational. There's no way your idea is the same thing as that living reality. Thoughts are never reality. Often misguided, and they often lead to unwise action. That when we're insecure and we have insecure thoughts and we act out of them, we create responses that then deepen our sense of insecurity. So we're caught in this stimulus-reaction kind of a cycle, and this what I'm calling this subcortical looping. And it leads to the actions that come out of our fears. Either we speed up, get tense, and really get our bodies sick. We also try to control others. We try to prove ourselves a lot. We try to defend and present a lot. And there's a lot of aggression, whether it's just our minds having judgmental thoughts, our, in large ways, bullying, attacking, hurting. It means that we're no longer living, we're no longer inhabiting our awareness in our heart. We're not living from a more evolved, awakened sense of our being. We're reacting out of the more primitive parts of our brain. They've taken over, they've hijacked, and we need to find our way home. And pretty much the central practice that we start with when we begin mindfulness training. To use the breath as an anchor and notice when we're in thoughts so that rather than living inside them, you're aware that they're happening. And the point isn't to get rid of thoughts, but to just know that they're there so you don't mistake them for reality. You have a choice. If you can say, oh wait, this is a thought. It feels really real. It's really strong. It's creating a lot of power. I even can tell I'm believing it. But there's even a little bit of you that says, please, let me remember, I don't have to believe it. You're on the right track. You're opening the door of awareness, letting the light come through. Rumi says, be empty of worrying. Think of who created thought. You stay in prison when the door is so wide open. So we begin that. That's the first step. Please don't believe your thoughts. And by the way, I like the phrase, okay, the thoughts are real, but they're not truth. Then we take the next step, which is this invitation to deepen presence. Please, may I pause? May I contact what's right here? And you can sense that for yourself, just as you're listening right now. That if you even invite yourself, please, really sincere, please, may I pause, and really arrive in presence, connect with my senses. There's a tremendous amount of mindfulness research that shows that as we begin to step out of thoughts and become more awake and aware in our senses, it deactivates the limbic system and activates the prefrontal cortex. Now, what's interesting for meditators is that when we pause, we're actually on purpose noticing what's going on in the present moment. Now, the most challenging part, though, is what we contact is all the arousal, the unpleasant, uncomfortable stuff, the very stuff we've mastered over a lifetime to not hang out with, right? We've spent decades learning how to move away from unpleasantness. So this simple invitation, please, may I pause and be with what's right here, is actually saying, please, may I pause and get myself ripped up and squeezed and squished and achy and sore and feeling all this like conundrum going on inside us. It's not easy. It's not easy to learn to stay. Which leads us to the third invitation. Please, may I remember love. Because if we regard the situation with a quality of tenderness, all of a sudden we find we can stay. There's just enough space, softness, kindness, so we can hang out with what's there. Because we're not so inside it and caught in it as a victim. Rather, then in some way there's a remembrance of love. The what we are opens, and we become a bigger space of presence. And one pathway of remembering love is to simply have the intention to offer love or care inwardly. And it could be through words or an image, or I often put my hand on my heart. And even having the intention and going through the motions works. Why does it work? Because deep, deep down, the who we are is loving presence. By going through the motions, we begin to call that forth. We begin to reconnect with more of the truth of who we are. And another pathway is, when we say, please remember love, is to call on the love that we know is in the universe and ask to be held by it. Well, when we imagine feeling hugged, that imagining, and this has been shown in MRIs, just imagining does the same thing. It begins to bring us back into that integrated state. So just to call on love. Can you put your hand on your heart? Well, there's a reason that works. And when we put our hand on our heart, the actual warmth, this neural center right here in the heart area, actually calms down the sympathetic nervous system. So, story for you on one example of somebody that's used these 3 invitations. And this is a woman who was in that sandwich time of life where she had a son in 8th grade who was having a hard time in his own ways, and her father was in a nursing home. And the nursing home was about an hour away, so she'd go for a visit once a week. And he had dementia and would repeat himself a lot, but clearly the big message that he gave her was, please stay, please come more often. And it wasn't resentful. It was just, he really liked having her around. But her inner, this was a stimulus, her inner reaction was feeling tight and resentful, feeling the need to justify herself because she felt she was failing. It triggered off her sense of not enough, that she was failing her son. She wasn't, showing up enough for her son. She was failing her father, failing on all fronts. And then she was also living with the sense that she would be, how incredibly regretful she'd be if he died. And this was their last years together or whatever. So this is what she brought her practice to. Okay, the stimulus again was her father saying, oh, I wish you'd be around more, her son acting out in ways, and her then going into that looping of what's wrong with me, and also blaming them in different ways, and then the feelings of fear and shame and so on. So her practice was first to notice the thoughts, I'm a bad daughter, I'm a bad mother, and just whisper, please don't believe this. Just that. Please don't believe this. And then come into her body. She'd say, please just come and touch what's here, right here in this body. And she'd feel it was there, and she'd feel the fear and kind of shame. And then, please, may I be kind. Put her hand on her heart. And she used those phrases, I'm sorry. Sorry meaning, I'm sorry these painful feelings are here, and I love you. So after one visit with her father, she sat in the parking lot and she was practicing this and saying, kind of trying not to believe the thoughts and saying yes and being kind towards all the tightness and fear, really feeling the waves of tears and grief, and realized that underneath it all, she just loved her son and she loved her father, and she didn't want to let them down, but more than that, she just wanted to trust the loving. Just trust the loving. In a way, that was her realization. It's like, don't believe the thoughts. Come into a wise relationship with yourself. And then just trust the loving. Trust who we are. So for her, after some rounds, she started noticing more and more. She'd be with her father, and when he'd say something like, oh, I wish you'd be coming more, or whatever, rather than trying to justify herself, she would just feel a wave of, oh, he loves me, I love him. It was okay. The imperfectness was okay. And he'd be repeating what he repeated. He'd look at this tree out the window and say, isn't that a beautiful tree? And she could just relax and really go, yeah, that's a really beautiful tree. Because she wasn't wound up in that looping that we've been talking about of stimulus reaction. She was responding, not reacting to the situation. To the degree that we suffer, we are believing thoughts that are not true, and we're caught in some kind of reacting looping that's keeping us identified with something that's smaller than the truth of who we are. We need to train ourselves. We need the time to pause and to learn not to believe our thoughts, to pause and to come into presence, to pause and be kind so that we can be living, inhabiting the highest part of our being. We'll close together in a simple way, just taking some moments, as we've been describing, to pause together. And you might bring to mind some where you get triggered, and probably encourage you not to bring one where you get triggered in a very huge or traumatic way, but somewhat triggered, where you get irritated, or you get judgmental, maybe hurt or defensive, some way reactive. It could be a situation with another person, or if it's something to do with your health or traffic, it doesn't matter, whatever it is. Put yourself into the situation enough so you can get a taste of it right now. This is just to give you a taste, and then you can practice as you go. But when it's going on, what are the thoughts that are going on in your mind? What are you believing? What are you believing about other people or yourself? What are you telling yourself about the world? And you might explore just saying to yourself something like, please don't believe your thoughts. You don't have to believe these beliefs. Real but not true. And then invite yourself into presence. Say, please just come right here and feel what's going on in your body, your heart, maybe your throat or your belly. Just please, may I just contact and connect with a kind of an intimate presence with what's right here. You might breathe with it. And the third invitation, please may I relate with kindness. May I remember love. And for now, you might want to just, with that gesture of lightly touching the heart, if there's any message that would most bring healing, wisdom, comfort, more truth to your own being. And in this responding, instead of reacting, just sense your own experience right now of presence, the quality of heart and awareness that's right here, the possibility of homecoming to a more full expression of your being, the light, the spirit, the heart, the truth. That's really your essence. May we each discover this pathway of homecoming in the way that really allows us to trust our natural being. And may we live our days from this presence, from this loving. Namaste and thank you.